Hello, Pyotr Kurzin. You are a British geopolitical analyst, I would say. You have amassed quite a following on YouTube for your geopolitical analysis. And just before we turn on the cameras, just before we started recording, I wanted to ask you how you see things from a British perspective. And then you told me, and I guess it's quite easy to tell by your name, that you're originally Russian and that you've spent a lot of time living outside the UK. So I just want to get clear. I mean, you don't have you don't have to give any declaration of loyalty here, right? But I was wondering, like, how do you see yourself? Because I think it would be insightful to think about how you see the world geopolitically compared to how you see yourself. Like, what is your alignment, I would guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you firstly for having me on the invitation. It's very kind of you. We are about to surpass 50,000 subscribers, which is pretty cool. And I welcome anyone to join that community. I try to be as diverse in my opinions. I don't necessarily ascribe to opinions that I will acknowledge, but I think it's important to acknowledge how people see things and whether or not, acknowledgement is an endorsement, put it that way. But I would say two things to your initial question, which is that I am half English, but I'm also half Russian. I was born in the UK, but I've tried to diversify my opinions because I was lucky enough to travel from a young age, and also my parents met in a quite unique story, very romantic, unique story. And I think that that has instilled a de desire to appreciate different places. I lived in Africa for a while and have worked on many different regions and affairs. So even if I come from a Western background, I think it's important to acknowledge the alternatives and sometimes the alternative perspectives, which might be more accurate or reasonable, right? The Russians sit very firmly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is what we're going to be talking about predominantly, versus the West. And I don't necessarily disagree with some of the points from the Kremlin. That doesn't make me a pro-Putinist. I can't stand Putin, but I think there's validity sometimes. As to the other point is that generally, I think political labeling has lost all relevancy or substance these days. And what I mean by that is that people will hear what I say, they'll see where I come from or what I've done in terms of my professional career, and they'll make a bunch of assessments about everything else that I ascribe to. So because I do believe climate change is an issue, people will be like, oh, so he supports, mass vaccinations, enforced things like that. He's a globalist, these sorts of terms. And that's not true. I do agree with certain policies, but I don't agree with all. And that's, I think, a good framing for our conversation from here on out, which is that I am critical of aspects of this situation in the Middle East across the spectrum. I'm not entirely one camp and I'm not entirely another, but because people hear me say one thing in one specific moment, they're like, "Oh, he must be completely like that," which is not the case. And I plan to make a video about this because I think the simplification of political labeling and ideology, if that makes sense, is a huge problem, only conflated and exaggerated by social media and such. So there's a sort of broad opening. I look forward to where we go from here.
Yeah, well, you gave me so many questions to ask. I guess the first would be, well, I'm not gonna ask it, but I was wondering about where exactly you've lived in Africa. What's the deal with your parents, all that. But I want to move to that thing you mentioned when you said that Russia stands firmly on the Israel issue and the West does not. So could you elaborate on what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, throughout, again, we're going to be skipping over a lot of historical context here and relevancy, but largely speaking, in the Israel-Hamas war or the broader Israeli-Palestinian situation, there has been a divergence of opinion between non-Western allies or countries and Western allies or countries. Largely speaking, that most of the West supports Israel largely than it doesn't support. Not in everything, we need to be clear on that. Much like Russia and China, as the two, shall we say, main countries that I'm thinking of, support Palestine, or they have sympathy for the Palestinian cause more than the Israelis. And Russia, one can argue whether or not this is simply Russia wanting to be different to the West, because that's how it has established itself in the post Cold War era, or because it genuinely stands by Palestinian statehood. Now, there is one caveat with this, which I think a lot of people overlook, which is that when the Russians and the Chinese, and this isn't necessarily a critique, it's just an observation, about the pathway for Palestinian statehood, it often isn't substantiated with more than we agree with the 1967 borders, right? Administered by the UN, or right. But that's as far as it goes. There isn't ever an actual push within the Security Council of the United Nations, for example, to actually implement this. And that's because if that were to happen, the recognition of the Palestinian state, that would lead to a awkward situation for the Russians over, say, Kosovo, or the Chinese over Taiwan, because it talks about self-determination. So again, there's a huge difference between the vocalism, winning brownie points through, well-worded statements, but optics is very important in international relations and geopolitics. And other than those worded statements, the countries rarely follow through. Now, you can argue about what's said in the West as well. The West has said many things along the lines of we want a two-state solution. Okay, right? How, guys? What are we going to do in this situation? And British government, French government, European governments, capitals are not often good at following up with more substantiated details there. So that's largely the difference that I emphasize.
That was an interesting insight. Although I would like to ask you, do you think really that is it fair to say that historically the Russians have been sympathetic towards the Palestinian Arabs? Because I would say that it's true that historically the Russians have backed the Arabs, but they were not backing the Palestinian Arabs. They were backing their essentially their allies in the Cold War, right? Until Egypt signed the peace agreement with Israel, which essentially also turned Egypt into an U.S. ally, right? So I don't know if I would say that Russia has. I don't know if I would say that Russia has supported Palestine historically, although I guess you could say that for Russia, being the anti-Western power, the strongest talking point would be anti-imperialism, and the narrative in the Eastern Bloc, which you probably know more about than me, and I would like to hear your insight into this. But the narrative in the Eastern countries, in the non-Western countries, is that one of the vices of the West has been and is imperialism, and that Israel, in a sense, is an example of imperialism, right? That's the narrative of the certainly
Yeah,
of the Arab world, right? So what do you think about that? I mean, I wouldn't say that Russia has
I
been.
a good distinction, and I'm glad you make that clarification or add that extra detail layer of information because in the time that I've been covering the war, the situation since October 7th, it's been extremely difficult. It's been a war of narratives, like any war,
Oh,
increasingly.
for sure.
And the Russian position is quite nuanced. You are right to say, personally, I don't really think Putin gives too much of a shit about the Palestinian cause, much like Trump doesn't really. This is the new world we're in, which is neo-imperialism. One article in Financial Times said, big powers, not necessarily great powers, but big powers or big players on the chessboard are increasingly discarding the interests or relevancy of smaller states, like what we're going to see in Saudi Arabia in the next week or so, right? Trump is meeting with Putin. Where's Ukraine? Where's Europe? They're not even there or invited. And so, how this is framed in the broader Israeli-Palestinian situation is that the Russians utilize this point about the Palestinian cause to their self-interests. Is it really about Palestinian statehood for Palestinian statehood's sake, or does it fit a narrative? Does it fit an agenda set by the Kremlin, which is to call out and, by rate criticize the West for their hypocrisy, right? One of the biggest talking points of anti-Western entities is the double standards of Western governments when they try to preach about human rights, rule of law, democracy, and the way the United States has interfered in lots of governments in the past 80 years, etc. Right? These are the sorts of framing. So it's more about how they can leverage it in international relations, how they can win brownie points at the UN Security Council with the non-aligned states or third countries, Africa, Asia, and countries around the world look to Russia and they're like, yes, Russia has a fair point. What Israel and the Europeans and the Americans, etc., are saying, this is actually, about the Palestinians. But ultimately, Russia is as self-interested and I think pragmatically driven as anybody else. We've seen what's happened with the Putin interests after the Syrian collapse in December, or Assad collapse, I should make more specifically. So, yeah, I don't. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and it plays into a broader, as I said, geopolitical game of narrative, optics, and who can win the information war more than the actual details of the people stuck in the middle, in this case, the Palestinians or the Israeli and Palestinians. The, the,
So
the Russians want good relations with Arabs specifically because it benefits their presence in the Middle East. But ultimately, does it come down to specific ethnic groups or communities? No, that's something that no country I think would aspire to too much.
so what I understand from what you're saying is that the Russians essentially don't. Okay, the Russians don't really do anything too anti-Israel, I guess. In a sense, like they oppose Israel ideologically because it's part of the campaign of, I guess you could call it West smearing, right? Smearing the West. So
Yeah,
so you would just say, well, Israel is evil and it's backed by the West, therefore the West is evil. So you have to say that Israel is evil.
yeah.
So okay, so yeah, this is how I see it as well. Although I guess you could say that Russian Russian Israeli relationship is actually not that bad. Like if you really think about the things that are happening on the ground, the relationship between Russia and Israel is, well, they're not close allies, right? And they're on opposite blocks, but they haven't come to confront each other in a meaningful way, at least not like they did during the days of the Cold War, in which there were actual instances of Israelis fighting the Soviets directly, right? I guess in the war of 56, I think it was mainly. So these are so Russia and Israel, like they're enemies, but Israel doesn't say, tries not to be too vocal against Russia because it's afraid of Russia. Russia can cause a lot of trouble for the Israelis, and Russia, they mainly talk. That this is how I see it, at least. Am I mistaken?
No, I think I mean, again, this is an incredibly complex set of factors that we're trying to simplify, but largely speaking, yeah, I mean, the two have they have a cordial understanding, shall we say. I mean, the Syrian civil war is an example of this. After the past, shall we say, 6, 7 years, notably after 2017, when sort of ISIS was largely erased and Assad was beginning to gain more control again within the country. The Russians and the Israelis had to manage coordinate military operations there. If the Israelis want to launch an airstrike against Damascus, the Russians were
Yeah.
the arbiter, were the default controllers of the region. They were the big power, quote unquote, within the region. So there had to be a degree of coordination there, which requires a degree of tacit understanding. I wouldn't call it friends. I wouldn't call it partners. I would just say that they tolerated one another. And, the Israelis do have, I mean, I think there's a distinction here. Israel and Russia versus Putin and Netanyahu. Netanyahu is someone who has strongman tendencies. He does want to centralize the Israeli government, and some of the politicalization of certain bodies within the Israeli government well, they've been, I think, severely rejected and concerned by a lot of Israelis. He is in government with the most right-wing members in history of Israel. And that's, I think, something that he, illustrates. He does take a degree of, shall we say, appreciation for Putin's ability to command, control, centralized power, and ultimately, govern in a way that he thinks is necessary. You've got lots of strongman examples: Erdogan, Viktor Orban, Vucic in Serbia. Not saying that Netanyahu is maybe that bad, but he does certainly have a certain degree of political aspiration, and Putin is, well, arguably the modern day example of what it takes to be that successful. So I remember reading reports and thinking about their relationship in the late 2010s, particularly in the early 2010s as well, when Netanyahu was in government. There was cordiality between the two.
And it was also quite important for Netanyahu to show that he has a good relationship with Putin. It was one of his strong points to show that he has a good relationship with the Americans, but also that he can coordinate with Putin. But I have to add that it is my impression, and I think most Israelis would agree with this, that ever since the war in Ukraine broke out, Netanyahu stopped flaunting his relationship with Putin. And essentially, you don't hear them. It used to be that every time the two would be on a phone call, the prime minister office would say, oh, yeah, they talked and they agreed about several things. Or there was even a case, probably in the late 2010s, as you've said, that there was an Israeli woman who was held in Russian prison for some reason. I don't remember exactly what it was. And Netanyahu flew over to Moscow, and then Putin released her, and it was like this huge deal to show that these two have a great relationship and they can get along. So yeah, but it was this way. But now, since Ukraine, not so much.
That because I think that bleeds into what we were talking about, sort of imperialism, authoritative approaches, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine at a full scale level. I'm not denying that the West might have had provocations, or I don't not sympathize with Russia's insecurity because of NATO expanding or encroachment. I get those alternative arguments, but the emphasis being that it was not until February 24th, 2022, when the goalposts were moved, there was a conflict of some degree, which was relatively measured and contained, or whatever, specific in an area of Donbass. But it was the Kremlin that decided to move those goalposts and completely, relaunch full-scale conflict in all-out war in Europe for the first time in almost 80 years. And that is and his war of conquest, his war of to force the capitulation or absorption or whatever of Ukraine, be it physically or at least ideologically with the new government, is not something that I think Israel would agree with, because it goes against that sort of anti-imperialist emphasis that Western governments and such try to do. So yeah, and it would be very awkward for the Israelis to sort of be like, yeah, well, we sympathize with the Russians actually, because it doesn't
Yeah,
go
the
well.
sentiment in Israel is very much pro-Ukraine.
Yeah.
Very much pro-Ukraine, and but the government doesn't say anything because, of course, of the Russian presence in the Middle East. You don't want to get into trouble with them, but the sentiment is very much pro-Ukraine. Although I think another reason why this caused Putin and Netanyahu to maybe communicate less, or at least publicly less, is that it kind of made Putin seem incompetent, at least until Trump rose. We'll see how that unfolds, right? But I think the whole thing with the war stalling and not being as successful as most people originally thought the Russians would be successful, of course, way faster. That's what I thought, at least. So it kind of put Putin in a bad light, and I guess maybe Netanyahu didn't want to be associated with that, but that's a lot of speculation.
I think it's speculation, but I think it's grounded in a degree of confidence, right? This isn't just complete, there's substance to what I think we're both saying. It's based on historical examples of what we've already mentioned, and just generally where Israel currently sits, where Russia sits, the direction that the broader international system is going, and so on. So yeah, it is speculation, but I think it's relatively informed.
So take me to how you see the situation in Gaza now. You've essentially you've told us that your Well, you're half east, half west, so I guess it also gives you a unique position to view things through, right? And you don't consider yourself to be, well, I would consider myself to be a loyal Israeli, right? I mean, I try to be objective and to look at things properly, but in the end of the day, I want Israel to do well, right?
Yeah, of course.
So you coming with a kind of cosmopolitan perspective, how do you view the situation?
Well, it's interesting actually. You make me think sort of I've never really had a conversation with my Russian side about this with my father. Like he's incredibly anti-Putin, but he's also very critical of the West and its double standards. So I wonder what he would think about the Israeli Gaza Hamas situation because it's and not that that means that's what I think, but it's sort of how a proper Russian, full-blooded Russian would think about it. I mean, I am very torn. October 7th was one of the most heinous days that we will ever, I think, have in the 21st century, right? But the operations and scale by which the Netanyahu government, and I'm very particular with my words there, has responded is well, I mean, there's nothing left of Gaza. So, and Hamas is still there, to be honest. Is it severely decimated? And have I been supportive of Israel's actions against Hezbollah? Absolutely. But if anything, actually, caveat to that, I'd say I find myself less torn when it comes to Israel Hezbollah because the Israelis, I mean, the strike in downtown Beirut was pretty bad, but they have absolutely, incapacitated Hezbollah at a rate that we never thought they could, and I think that that is quite an achievement. But the situation, because it's Gaza, because it's the Palestinians, it's I think it's more complicated. Um, but I think that the current situation now is well, we're not in a good place. If you are pro-Palestinian or more Palestinian aligned, you will be appalled, horrified by Trump's comments and his unrelenting support for the Israeli government. As I've said before, I think it's pretty indicative of how Israelis themselves feel if they are out on the streets frequently protesting. Um, and I think
No,
the
that
part,
actually, I have to correct you there. The political discussion within Israel is quite right. There are protests, of course. The government is not especially popular now, but you shouldn't view this as well. If an election were to be held today, then the left would win. No, that's not what's going to happen.
no,
Like,
that's not what I'm
no. Ah, okay.
saying. There is no alternative to BB at the moment. That's quite clear.
There
But
probably
if
will be in the next election, though. I can mark one candidate that seems to try and he's doing quite well in the polls. So maybe. Sorry?
would that be Natalie Bennett or
Yeah,
right? Well, I mean, they tried to do that anti-BB Netanyahu coalition a couple of years ago, and the only reason that stuck together was because it was anti-Netanyahu, but that was
yeah.
not enough to make it a functional.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Although he had like a really small party, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
no mandate.
so now
So
the polls are more flattering. But again, like there's really no telling, and of course Netanyahu is not getting any younger. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it's not that it's not that the Israelis are opposed to what's happening in Gaza, right? They're concerned about getting the hostages back,
hmm.
and but it's not like they're thinking to themselves, "Whoa, what's happening in Gaza is a huge tragedy." No, they just want to get the hostages back. They feel like, of course, I'm generalizing, right? But many Israelis feel like really Hamas, what's happening in Gaza, it's Hamas's fault. That's how they would say. Because you would say, okay, the entire city is destroyed and Hamas is still operational. Well, what does that tell you about the way Hamas operates? Right? It tells you that it just put itself underground, left its human shields upstairs to suffer, and kind of uses them as a weapon of war.
So what's the solution there? Evacuate all Palestinian
Oh, there's
civilians?
no. I'm not saying that there is a solution, right? But this is the sentiment about evacuating all the Palestinians. I believe that it was the Israel hoped that it could do that at the start of the war. I don't know if you remember, but there were talks with Egypt about pulling the Gazans out into the Sinai Desert, right in Egypt. But of course, Egypt opposed that as it's not very sensible for Egypt to take in the Palestinians. It's just asking for trouble. I mean, historically speaking.
Yeah, but I mean, like, so what would be an option then? You can put all of the Palestinians outside of Gaza and then just blanket the whole strip with bombs to take all the Hamas fighters that are underground out. Like, what, what is what?
No, probably not. I think essentially once Hamas has captured so many hostages, they're kind of immune because what Israel would have preferred, I guess, would be to flood the tunnels, right? But they can't do it now because they'll just be flooding their own people, right? So this is out of the picture. You could maybe there's not much else you can do. You can just keep fighting, and I guess that the preferred Israeli solution would be to evacuate the Gazans. That's what I believe. But I don't think that even the Israeli government believes that this is feasible, right? So what I think they're going to try and do is something on the in the second Intifada style, that you keep the war going, but it's going to become very low intensity war. You just go in there. It's what happened in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, during the second Intifada. It's called the Chomat Magen in Hebrew. You just go in there, and over the process of several years, you just keep gathering intel and cleaning out nests. Now, of course, the question remains: okay, then what do you do with the Palestinian with the other Palestinians there, right? But yeah, it's a mess. The hostages essentially make it a mess, and I guess you could also say that, depending on your perspective, the citizenry of Gaza, although it's very difficult to distinguish between the citizenry and the non-citizenry, that's part of the problem, right? Um, the citizenry of Gaza is, in a sense, also a hostage.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's an impossible dilemma, isn't it?
Well, look, for me, really, since I have a loyalty in this manner, it's an easier dilemma for me, right? Because there's one group of people that I care more about than the other, right?
Yeah.
But it's I still acknowledge, of course, that it is a dilemma. Yeah, but
Well, there's the extreme scenario where, Israel just basically absorbs the West Bank and Gaza, and the Palestinians are forced to relocate somewhere, even though there are no states that want to, well, absorb them. So, but that's what the far right, ultra nationalist part of the Israeli government want to do. That's the extreme scenario. Arguably, it would probably, in some ways it'd be the simplest because it finally resolves the situation. I mean, I personally don't support that, but equally, from a pragmatic standpoint, the workability of the 1967 borders is has never looked, just from a geographical standpoint. I'm
yeah,
a geographer first and foremost. It looks absurd to have one bit of land over here, another bit over there, and somehow it's sort of connected through a tunnel or a land strip.
and it's also
That
indefensible for Israel in a sense, right? You can't really defend the centers of population when it's so
Yeah,
close to the.
would be targeted by raids, terrorist attacks, insurgencies. So yeah, it's not a viable long-term solution, but equally, we're so far in that now after 70, 80 years that no other country is willing to propose other radical solutions like, creating a new state somewhere or relocating. And as you said, Jordan and Egypt particularly are very adamant in not wanting to accept Palestinians. So we're at an impasse, and I would be amiss if I knew anyone who has the best solution that I've ever heard of. But turning Gaza into a Riviera is certainly not it. at the same time. So
Well, I want to throw maybe a couple of ideas just to hear what you think about it. We can think out loud, right? So, how about if you essentially you don't forcibly evacuate anyone, but you tell the Palestinians, listen, you tell people in Gaza, let's leave the West Bank alone for now. You tell people in Gaza, look, if you want to leave, you're free to do so. Here are the countries that would accept you. Okay. Plus, if you leave, us, maybe Israel, maybe part of the international community, you also have a chance to to give up on your refugee status. Because one of the problems with the Palestinians is that they've essentially inherited their refugee status since the days after the Second World War, and they're the only group of people, as far as I know, they're the only group of people on Earth who have done this. Right? There were German refugees, there were Pakistani refugees. You know, there were millions and millions of refugees all over the world, but none of them have remained refugees and inherited the status over two, three, maybe four generations by now, right? So give up on your Palestinian refugeehood, go live your life. Here's a grant. Goodbye.
yeah. I mean, this is getting difficult because we're essentially playing God here, or I mean, I think we should also
Oh,
caveat that
I'm
when
not saying that I necessarily I think we should do this, right? I'm throwing an idea just to hear
yeah.
what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's why I'm caveating in that I think people when they hear analysts or whoever, geopolitical, international relations, they sort of like, wow, how callous of you. You are just talking about as though those people don't exist. And it's like, but you have to do scenario framing if you ever want to consider post-war reconstruction, peace process. You have to think through specific scenarios to take into consideration how viable some of them are or not at all. So when I respond to you now, right, it's not because this is an endorsement, it's just because if we don't, then it would make the situation far more complicated. And it's just a reality at the moment. The geopolitical realities don't care about your emotive and sort of preferential stance. It's indifferent. So yeah, I mean, on this case, I think it would be very unlikely that all Palestinians would be willing to give up their relationship to the land. At the end of the day, if the land was somewhat of a, passable aspect, then they would have done so already. 2.3 million people living there, more than what, a couple percent of them have been killed now in the operations since October 7th. So, um, that I find it hard to believe that all Gazans would move. A proportion of them could do, a large proportion of them could do. Maybe the younger generations because they have less relationship to the land. Problem with that is that some of the younger generations are also more likely to be radicalized because of the way that they feel that Israel has acted, the way that Hamas can prey upon them now. So you could, but equally what are you seriously saying, not you specifically, but are we going to get a situation where sort of Israel or the US and Israel or whoever it is goes around the Middle East sort of with a shopping list of items like, okay, guys, so we've got Saudi Arabia is up, but they're only willing to take 35,000. We've got the Egyptians, but they only want 15K a year. We're sort of talking about Palestinians as though they're some kind of commodity, and how many are they going to import and sort of deport?
I don't think
So
it's without precedent.
yeah, so I think it would be extremely difficult to see which you'd have to work very hard at persuading countries to just take on the Palestinians.
Oh, for sure. And
Yeah,
there's
so
gonna have to be, well, as Trump would
yeah,
like to say, a deal.
so yeah, I think it's pretty integral that we keep that in mind. So, I mean, but again, as radical proposals go, because sometimes you need radicality, it's a reasonable one in the sense that you're not it's not forcible. Um, what's the word? You're not forcibly displacing them. You're not forcibly displacing them. You are trying to find a long-term gradualist solution whereby you communicate with all relative parties, including the Palestinians. You treat the Palestinians as a stakeholder. I think that's part of the problem is that many Palestinians don't feel they've been treated as a full-scale Palestinian on the same stakeholder on the same level. So if you said, look, we understand your situation and a relationship to the land, but pragmatically speaking, it's just not feasible. Would you be willing to relocate somewhere? And these are the countries, and then you talk to the governments. But again, this is all very idealistic, thinking
Yes,
that
but
everything's
you would have to give up on your refugee status. That's the key thing, because if you keep inheriting your refugee-ness, right, you end up with situations of people. There are millions of such people, right, living in the West for several generations, having a citizenship, having everything, who are still defined as Palestinian refugees, right? And
yeah,
the eternal refugeehood of the Palestinians is, in a sense, what keeps the conflict, well, burning, in a sense. And this is the way I see it. It's been created by the Arab states because they're the ones who wanted to destroy Israel to begin with, right? Mainly Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. But these states have since abandoned their war against Israel since they saw that they cannot win. Or for now, they believe that they cannot win. Maybe in the future things will change, right? And now the Palestinians are kind of stuck with it.
yeah,
But the Palestinian movement itself was started by the Arab countries.
yeah. I mean, I don't think that if you're going to get the forced um loss of refugee status, I mean, that's going to have to be replaced by something that Palestinians feel will ensure that they have some kind of basic security in any new country they move to. If they were just given what citizenship, unlikely residency, what kind of access will they have to basic amenities? Um,
No, but there are many Palestinians in the West who are considered by UNRWA, or well, not UNRWA because it's only in a certain position, but they are considered, like in international law, they're considered Palestinian refugees, but they could be millionaires living in the West
we're
with
not talking
citizenship and with everything.
talking about countries that would accept the Palestinians that live in Gaza. So that's 2.3 million people who would be relocated, say, in different quantities,
Okay, you're talking about Gaza specifically, right?
policies. Yeah, I'm not talking about the West. No, I'm talking about Middle Eastern. I don't want any more Palestinian refugees in Western countries because I think that that would not solve the problem.
Why
I
not?
think because I think that we have immigration in a situation in the West as it is, and locating Palestinians who are of a different culture, customs, and whatnot. This isn't anti-Islam necessarily. They need to be in places where there is a greater alignment in terms of values and interests, and also maybe closer to, well, the land that they consider to be theirs, or
Yeah, but that would be also a problem because if they're close, there are inevitably going to be attacks coming out of that territory into Israel, like what happened with Lebanon or even Jordan or even Gaza when it was under Egyptian control, right? So it's
maybe then maybe we can't forcibly displace them. Have to stay in Gaza.
yeah, okay. Well, I want to ask you another thing if we were on the subject of immigration, right? So for me as an outside observer who is well, as I've said, I try to think in a balanced manner, but I am biased to the degree that I want what's best for my country, right? So, but still, coming from that perspective, I look at the UK, and I look at Europe more generally, but I look at the UK specifically, both because of its, I guess you could say, importance and historical importance, and also because they speak English and I can understand what they're saying. So I look at the UK, and what I see worries me greatly when I mean the political Islam that seems to be becoming more and more mainstream. And I was wondering, what is your take on that? I mean, do you think that maybe I'm being fed too much specific information and it's not as bad as it seems? Or because I see the UK as going down a pretty bad road, and I'm worried, of course, about that because that road would end up also being bad for me.
Yeah, I think that this is something I'm grappling with. I would say, firstly, I feel quite politically homeless in this new day and age. We are experiencing an inflection point, a shift in the overall international order, in a way that we haven't seen arguably since the end of this Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed and it became US primacy, unipolar, US hegemon, etc. But now, Trump is increasingly internalizing the US in disengagement. We have multiculturalism. We have seen a huge influx of different migration flows into Europe, and we are seeing just generally a significant shift in the balance of power. And that is not just in economics, it's in geopolitics, it's in also the role of culture and the way that that bleeds into politics, populism, and immigration being one of the biggest drivers of that. My bachelor's was in migration. I studied a lot about migration, population science, and so on. And in the early 2010s, at the height of, shall we say, PC, more woke culture, there was this idea that migration is a fantastic element um, to multiculturalism, to development, and I'm still firmly in support of migration, but it has to be managed. It has to be well implemented. Certain types of migration. We have a huge problem with irregular migration across the globe, but in Europe, the open door policy of 2015-16 by the Merkel administration, or Germany particularly, was an absolute disaster. And we do have, well, I mean, there's 1.5 million plus, migrants in Germany. The car that was driven into the crowd, a woman and daughter who actually did eventually die. So we do have two fatalities, not just casualties of that, was Afghan. But that must be equally added with a point that most people who are part of migrant groups are not extremists. That is a tactic used by the right or the far right to demonize and villainize all migrants, which is not true. So many, undocumented workers, not that I like them to be undocumented, they should be documented. Why are they not documented? But they are a fundamental part of the United States economy. For example, another random example, construction jobs, a lot of jobs that Brits or Americans who don't want to do those manual jobs, they are uptaken by migrants. So migration is an incredibly important factor in any prosperity and long-term growth of a country. That being said, what we are seeing in the UK right now is seriously bad. I am extremely against the rise over acceptance sometimes. I've vacillated between being sort of socially left or socially moderate or whatever. I think, established that I'm somewhat socially moderate in that, we accept in the UK you can exercise your freedom to religion and speech and so on. Yeah, that is a thing that makes us a democracy. That's why we're different to Saudi Arabia. You can't, show your religion publicly in Saudi Arabia, or otherwise you'll be reprimanded. It's illegal. But at the same time, I think we're going too far in the UK. Multiculturalism doesn't work. It doesn't lead to integration. It leads to subsets of communities that become increasingly separate, isolated, or whatever. And it becomes a mess. England is a primarily Christian country. I'm not particularly religious, but I am noticing the role that religion has in certain degrees of upholding basic norms and values of a predominantly secular state. So I think a party that has it quite well balanced is the CDU, the Christian Democrat Union in Germany. Their shift to the right to appease some of the sort of AFD supporters in the past week, 2 weeks, I'm sure you've seen that in the news, is that
No,
tacking
please,
to the
please elaborate on that.
basically the upcoming German election has a lot of importance, and the new leader of the CDU, Merz, is there was a bill he tried to push through with sort of the tacit support of the AFD as a way to strict and strengthen certain immigration policies, which, if you read between the lines, aren't actually that unreasonable. But because it was affiliated with the AfD, a lot more progressives or socially liberal parts of the German electorate freaked out, thinking it was some kind of draconian thing, which it wasn't really. But this is the balance and the difficulty when you've got so many people shifting to the political fringes of the spectrum because of their disillusionment with the establishment, the centers, right? So, point I'm making is that I do think there needs to be a greater enforcement of like, if you come to Europe, you understand that we are a Christian continent, first and foremost. We accept your ability to express yourself differently, but I don't know. I mean, it sounds arbitrary, but if you're walking down the street and you hear very loud, like there's a different, there is a double standards here, which I have noticed. The protests last year in the UK,
The anti-Israel ones.
no, the ones that were in response to deaths of the murders,
Oh yeah,
three little girls. I
it
mean,
was a protest by people who were against the murder of girls that was perpetrated by Muslims, right? Something like that.
no, this is the problem, right? So far right individuals take the growing anti-Islam feelings, sentiments, anti-Islamic feelings, and prey upon that. The culprit was actually a African descendant born in Wales who did it, but there was a fake website which Musk reshared on Twitter, and everyone thought therefore it was a Muslim, which it wasn't. But that's still a separate point to that there was a greater clamping down of, shall we say, pro-British rallies than there were protection of, anti-Islam ones. So there was a lot of movement with a lot of rallies with Islamic music and culture, but sort of we weren't there was a double standards there in the people who were simply trying to express more British values were seen to be one quite nationalist and therefore more of a danger. You've seen this with the Palestinian and Israeli protests if you look at it. I mean, you've got plenty of Palestinian rallies. I shadowed one just to sort of get a sense of the vibe, and it was peaceful and it was very, constructive in its intentions. But I did then shadow a more Israeli or sort of less, shall we say, sympathetic to the Palestinians. And there was a much more notable police presence. There was a sort of sense that, well, these people are going to be more ruckus. And it was sort of like, well, no, they're just a little bit less pro multiculturalism and progressivism like that. So largely speaking, I agree with you in that I am not very um, positive about the direction of the UK at the moment. I think there needs to be a greater willingness to uphold British values, which are more clearly defined. Again, this is not preventing people from being able to practice their separate things. There are plenty of Brits who have been born into the UK who are of a Islamic background, who are of a Hindu background because of, well, Britain's colonial empire, right? The irony is that some of the biggest supporters of the great days of the British Empire don't seem to realize that that is the consequence of colonizing lands. They will want to come to the wealthier part of the colony of the empire to better themselves. So people who, if you look at polls, have been very supportive of, a return to greater British exceptionalism and these sorts of things are also the ones who then complain about, those foreigners taking our jobs, they're making our streets more dangerous. Well, then you shouldn't support imperialism then, because that's kind of the consequence over generations. So it's a difficult one, but I certainly think, regardless of what's happened in the past, we can't change that. What we can do now, there needs to be a greater, much stricter immigration controls. I'm absolutely appalled with the mass irregular immigration, illegal immigration that's constantly happening across the channel. That I will not be even remotely sort of, I don't know, try to sort of lightly say. But in terms of upholding more British values, which are sort of Christian aligned or European aligned, yeah, I think we need to be doing a more informed job of that, because constant emphasis of everyone's the same and homogenous and progressivism is it's not working, and that's why reform are gaining more and more and more support in the polls. and Labour and the Conservatives are seen as, washed up, out of touch, and unwilling to take more, assertive steps.
Yeah, not thinking about outside the square,
No.
right? So, okay, I want to go back to your reluctance to evacuate Gaza, essentially, right? So, of course, that reluctance is perfectly understandable. What I want
As
to add, though, is that what I fear as an Israeli is that, well, Israel is not always going to have the upper hand, right? And what I am starting to, many people at least, I don't know about myself, but many people are starting to think, well, if we're not always going to have the upper hand, and a day might come where the enemy might have the upper hand, we don't think that they will have any qualms about deporting us or exterminating us, right? So why shouldn't we deport them first?
I'm not sure I understand the.
Okay, so imagine that Gaza remains under Hamas control and fast forward 100 years, okay? And, maybe there were some more dramas, but essentially there is still a significant Palestinian population in between the river and the sea, right? Um, they could one day eradicate the Jewish people of Israel, deport them, eradicate them, kill them. Basically the same thing that um, Emperor Hadrian did, right back in Roman times. So what I'm thinking is, um, if you're not always going to have the upper hand, then you might as well try to make the situation better for you in the future. So maybe you should deport them. So what do you think about that line of reasoning?
Well, it doesn't solve the root cause. It's
What's the
a
root cause?
Well, you can't just deport a bunch of people and expect them not to just try to come back. You need to give them enough of incentive to leave on their own.
Why did the Germans not come back to Sudetenland?
I'm not sure I get the comparison.
Yeah, I mean the Germans. There were millions of Germans who were deported from Sudetenland. It's in today's Czech Republic, right? So why didn't they try to go back there? They were deported. Same goes for Kaliningrad, right? What used to be Königsberg, it's now Russian territory.
Right.
So why did it work there?
Well, it hasn't necessarily fully worked there. There's discussions about incorporating Kaliningrad back into one of the Baltics or Germany, Poland. So
Yeah, but it's
it
not. It's better than well, it's not war, and it's been not war for what, almost 100 years, 80,
hmm.
right? What do you think about that? You don't have to really give like an informed opinion, right?
Look, I mean, look, very simply, Laurent, you're not going to move 2.3 million people and expect no consequences from that. You are not going to eradicate Hamas entirely. It's just impractical. Either you have to coexist, or Israel absorbs Gaza and West Bank, and there is a conceited effort, a very concerted effort rather, to encourage or re-educate, unlearn, relearn Palestinians to be Arab Israeli or be part of the state as it is. You're not going to just move 2.3 million people and that's the end of it. It's just not going to happen. So I think we need to find, an alternative way of looking at it because you can't just deport 2.3 million people. It's not going to happen.
Yeah,
You
okay.
need
I think I get you.
clear itinerary of states. You need a clear plan. Trump is just saying, let's deport them. Okay, where are you going to put them, dude? Who's going to take them? No one's going to take them. Okay, so then what? You've got a stateless bunch of people in somewhere in the world. Okay, that makes sense. It's like the Uyghurs or the Kurds. It's not a solvable issue unless there is a degree of compromise. And as we're seeing right now with the tensions rising in northern East Syria, Turkey wants to go in there and essentially try to, I don't know, blanket the Kurds. or at least get rid of the YPG. So I don't know, you tell me. You're the expert.
Oh, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert by any means, but I was having a thought and I was sharing it. I think it's. I think it's. The comparison is interesting. That there was a period of time that created a lot of refugees, but only one group of refugees has remained refugees, and these are the Palestinian refugees, right?
I mean,
So,
look, in an ideal world, the Palestinians would accept that the situation is untenable. They're living in an incredibly cramped land. The Israelis are largely in control of the whole thing, and they would either accept that they join Israel and Israel becomes the full area, or they move to a new area which they have less historical association, but maybe it's time to, move on. I know it's incredibly difficult to say this, and therefore Israel becomes that full area. We don't have the most complicated geopolitical situation in the world. That would be ideal. It would be
mm,
ideal for them to join Jordan, Egypt, other countries where they could be a part of, but they resist. And so, well, what do we do with that? Do we have no humanitarianism at all, and we just deport them and relocate them forcibly, which, well, that's going to be incredibly, as I said, for reasons, or we try to find a compromise, which isn't exactly working, and the two-state solution, I think, is rather on life support, if that. So I really don't know, to be honest with you,
mhm.
mate. I don't have an answer for you, and
Well,
that's why
I'll have to
you
end
and
up agreeing with you about what you said about Hamas. That Israel is not going to destroy Hamas. Now, here's the thing: even if Israel does destroy Hamas, let's say as a functioning body, right? Hamas actually means Harakat Muka'ama Islamiyah. That's what it stands for. Hamas, Harakat Mukawama Islamiyah. It means the movement of Islamic resistance. This is what it means. So, you're not going to stop the movement of Palestinian resistance, of Islamic resistance, right?
Mm.
So, even if the entirety of Hamas were theoretically to be wiped off the face of the earth, all of them gone, there will be a
Yeah.
new Hamas.
It's I hate it because I want there to be peace first and foremost. Let's just get to the brass tacks of it. I want peace. I want stability. I want prosperity for the region, for the place. And I hate to see, maybe it's my youth or my naivety or ignorance. I'm sure some people listening today or watching this will think, well, he has no idea what he's talking about. No, it's just because I'm internally conflicted. What I would prefer to happen is not necessarily what maybe is just the simplest, best pragmatic solution. And the older you get, they say the more realistic you become or pessimistic you become. So, I'd love there just to be a state in that area which is coexistent of Palestinians and Israelis because they can both have a connection to the land that they see for them as deep and meaningful. But at the same time, the reality of the situation will not, I think, right now or ever at this point again, really yield that. We're too far into a unresolvable situation or irresolvable situation whereby when Hamas what it did on October 7th, which people will argue was because of the long-standing treatment of Israel. We can go back constantly. So I'm just going with October 7th, which is that because of what they did, the Israelis felt, right, we can never allow or risk that happening again. But what's that done? That has completely fucked. I'm just going to be really blunt. It's completely screwed any potential of a two-state solution coexistence. I just can't see that anymore. But equally, I don't want to be the one who says, right, well, we should just deport the Palestinians, because that sounds really terrible to just tell a bunch of people, right, you're disposable, you're expendable. That is tough. So it's really difficult. And I really don't know what the best solution is. That's why I've, to be honest with you, never really engaged on Israel and Palestine in my geopolitical journey until October 7th, because it's such a figurative minefield. And I wish there was a simpler answer, but I really don't. So, you know.
Before we wrap it up, do you want to maybe share some of your thoughts about what's happening in Ukraine now? You probably know more than me about that.
Well, Ukraine is a lot simpler, not necessarily from the historical angles, but simpler in the sense that we have very clearly defined borders. People who are pro-Putinist will argue, well, Ukraine wasn't a sovereign state. Well, it was in 1919 to 1922, the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, but let's not pretend we know history. What Putin is doing is the use of might, and might is right. It's forced, again, acquisition. Sovereignty accounts for nothing. And, it sets a dangerous precedent in that, Venezuela will just try and annex Iguazu in a part of Guyana. The Turkey will just annex more of Syria. China will just do whatever it wants with Taiwan and other areas of its near abroad. So Ukraine is, the most significant war, not just from a sort of way it changes the world in a military sense or geopolitically, but also ideologically. It really is returning us to a time of, to quote Thucydides, the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must, or paraphrase what roughly that's the quote. So smaller states are stuck in the middle. It's bad.
And Ukraine
And
is not even that small and weak, right?
so, the war in Ukraine will have a simpler solution in that either the war continues along the current lines and it's Europe that steps up and Russia continues and then someone implodes or one side sweeps eventually, or this upcoming peace deal signifies a quite clearly defined loss of territory for the Ukrainians, but it becomes much clearer that Ukraine is heavily militarized. That doesn't necessarily mean being part of NATO. They have a deeper integration with the EU, possibly from an economic standpoint. But then, in the future, does the United States return? I don't know who runs Gavin Newsom wins the election in 2029 or something, and we've got a more internationalist US return, and therefore the Ukraine war is suddenly the US returns and starts supplying Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are like, right, we're gonna try and take back our territory, and so the war kicks off again. Or does Putin remobilize, deepen ties with China even more, galvanize forces, and then he tries to do what he wanted to do 3 years ago? So there's a lot of unknowns here, but the point I'm making is that it's a lot more clearer cut sort of set of boundaries just because of territorial integrity, because of clearly defined borders, unlike in Israel and Palestine or Israel and Gaza. And there's the other element of non-state actors. You know, we're living in a world where sovereign states, nation states, aren't the only way that people collect themselves. And when you've got extremist groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, that complicates things even more. I want nothing more than those groups to be eradicated. But the problem is that they're so nomadic or location independent. It's very hard to tell if you've ever fully got rid of the cells. I mean, look at what happened with ISIS, where we've got them popping up in the Sahel in Western Africa now. So, if it's also insane that we've got this war happening at the time that we've got the worst conflict between Israel, Palestine, Israel, Hamas simultaneously. The only thing left to add to that of flashpoints is Taiwan. So if Ukraine were to become quote unquote stabilized at some form, then maybe we could see a better concentrated effort to find a sustainable solution to Israel and Hamas, Israel, Gaza, Palestine, in some way. But tension is divided, and equally countries are internalizing or prioritizing their own issues. So, I think the situation in Israel and Gaza, to bring it back to our original discussion, is going to be in a state of flux for a long time.
I think
And
so too.
yeah, unfortunately. So maybe the Palestinians will accept and they will be relocated, and the situation is resolved for itself. But
Maybe enough of them will, right?
maybe, maybe. And again, it's I think we've had a good conversation, and I appreciate your perspective, and I think we should reconvene and talk about it in the future and try to be more solutions based than simply not that we haven't been or you haven't been, but because it's a
Where can
different.
people find you if they want to see more of your stuff?
Well, I presume this will be on your YouTube channel,
Yeah.
so people can click through on the title of my tag name in the title of the video or on the description, I guess. And I try to engage people from both sides in the sense of I will no, I'm not going to engage Hamas, but I'm going to people who are maybe more Palestinian oriented, as well as Israeli oriented. I've mainly done the Israeli side. But yeah, and I talk about Ukraine, I talk about China, I talk about everything geopolitical. I also cover a lot of Africa and forgotten conflicts because I think it's important to keep those in mind. And you can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok.
Great. Pyotr, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you very much, Duran. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.